Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Luke Deckard Show. I'm your host, Luke Deckard. So tonight, I have a really special guest here. Yeah, very, very excited about tonight. I have Oscar-nominated writer-director Nicholas Meyer. He's a name that you'll probably all know for all sorts of reasons. He's written some incredible Sherlock Holmes books and has written and directed a handful of great films, both in the cinema and for television as well. Um, yeah, so like for example, some of his books. You have the 7% Solution, which was a terrific Sherlock Holmes novel. Most recently, there's the Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols and the Return of the Pharaoh, which we'll be talking about a lot tonight. In terms of films, he's wrote and directed Time After Time, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, co-wrote Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and was the director and also writer on Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, and many, many, many more. I could name it all off, but that would take up all the time. So what we'll do is we'll actually just bring Nicholas on now. So without further ado, Nicholas Meyer, everybody. Hello, Nicholas.
Hi, it says the host has unmuted your mic, so
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
You
Thank
are
you.
here and we can hear you. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
It's a pleasure. So
yeah,
far, it's a
really,
pleasure. Yeah.
really pleased to have you on. Yeah, it's so strange because I remember being a youngin and watching, particularly growing up, I watched a lot of Star Trek. So my first sort of introduction to your work was Star Trek 2, 4, and 6, and I watched. So it's really exciting to be able to chat with you about two of my favorite things, and that is Sherlock Holmes and Star Trek, and just your career in general. Um, we got people in the chat already. Bonnie Big Bird is saying hello, so hello, Bonnie.
Bonnie is saying hello already.
Yep, she's here. She is here and listening in. Hello, Bonnie. Hello. It's all thanks to Bonnie. Bonnie helped set this up. So hello, Bonnie. And
I think she manages my career generally. I think it was thanks to Bonnie that on January 14th, I got to speak in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
I told my girlfriend I'm going to speak in the House of Commons, and she said, "Not the House of Lords," which kind of brought me down to size. But anyway, so fancy
Yes.
how I owe Bonnie. I keep owing Bonnie a lot.
She's a wonderful person. Wonderful person. So let's dive in. Let's dive into your career and chat about some of that stuff. So let's start with Sherlock Holmes. As I mentioned, your first Sherlock Holmes novel was The 7% Solution, where Holmes goes and seeks the help of Dr. Freud to deal with drug addiction and things like that. It's a terrific book made into a terrific film as well. What was the writing process of that? What inspired that particular book, The 7% Solution?
I wish that my answers were not long-winded, but they tend to be.
That's all right.
I was introduced to Sherlock Holmes when I was about 11, when my father gave me the complete one volume of all 60 stories. And I think, and I've said this on more than one occasion, that works of art that you encounter, or maybe not just works of art, people, when you're at a young age, we're what we're called an impressionable age. They make an impression.
Yeah.
And so Sherlock Holmes made a big impression.
Yeah.
And I was very crazy about those stories. I wolfed them down. When I was a kid growing up in Manhattan, which is an island on the east coast of the United States, all the rage was a musical called My Fair Lady.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to see My Fair Lady as a kid around the same time as I'm reading these Holmes stories. And I thought, gosh, Henry Higgins of 27A Wimpole Street with Colonel Pickering just back from India seems an awful lot like Sherlock Holmes of 221B Baker Street with Dr. Watson just back from Afghanistan. And Higgins and Holmes, note the alliterative names, are both deducers.
Yes.
Higgins is mainly about language and Holmes is about everything. But I thought, gee, My Fair Lady is based on Shaw's play Pygmalion, which is the same characters, which was written at the height of Sherlock Holmes's popularity. And it occurred to me that George Bernard Shaw was ripping off Arthur Conan Doyle. And I thought, well, if Pygmalion made a great musical, Sherlock Holmes should make an even better musical. So I was writing in high school my own musical, and then somebody came out with one called Baker Street.
Yes.
And so that kind of disillusioned me, and I went off Holmes for a while and got on with my life. And then later on, I found myself rereading the stories and being enchanted once more. And by this time, I was making my move from New York to California to seek my fortune making movies. But along the way, I started to discover all these books about Sherlock Holmes and women, Sherlock Holmes and music, Sherlock Holmes and you name it. People have written articles or books about it. And the other thing that happened was that in high school, people would say to me, "Oh, your old man's a shrink. Is he a Freudian?" And I didn't know. So I asked him, I said, "Pop, are you a Freudian?" And he said, "It's a silly question." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because it's no more possible to discuss the history of psychoanalysis and not start at least with Freud than it is to discuss the history, say, of the discovery of America by Europeans and not start with Columbus or the Vikings, take your pick. But to think that nothing has happened since the Vikings is to be pretty rigid, pretty doctrinaire." And he went on to say, "When a patient comes to see me, I listen to what they say. I listen to how they say it. I'm especially curious as to what they do not say. I'm interested in how they're dressed. Are they punctual? What's their body language? I am, in short," said he, "looking for clues from them as to why they are not happy." And I said, "Gee, Pop, that sounds like detective work, what you do." And he thought about it and he said, "Well, yeah, it is kind of like detective." And suddenly this light bulb goes off in my dim brain that I suddenly realized who my father always reminded me of, which was Sherlock Holmes. And it was probably not an accident that he gave me the book. And so then I thought, gee, how much, I wonder, did Arthur Conan Doyle know about the life and writing of Sigmund Freud? And the first thing that strikes you is, oh, they're both doctors, and they both died in the same town within 9 years of each other.
Yeah.
And let's see, Sherlock Holmes is a cocaine addict. So for a time was Sigmund Freud. And Freud discovered cocaine when he wrote a paper with two eye doctors, Königstein and Köhler, on the uses of cocaine as an anesthetic during eye surgery. Interestingly enough, Arthur Conan Doyle studied ophthalmology in Vienna.
Yep.
And I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I was starting to think there may be something here. and what I didn't learn until years after the book was published and the movie was made is that Freud always knew he had been compared with Sherlock Holmes. That I knew. In fact, he wrote about it. He said in one of his cases, and when you read Freud's cases, it does sound a lot like Watson writing. I followed the labyrinth of her mind, Sherlock Holmes-like, until it led me to. But the one thing I didn't learn until later is that Freud loved reading Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was Freud's bedside nighttime reading. I wish I'd known that. I would have stuck it in the book someplace.
Yes.
Anyway, that's how it happened.
I love that. What's so interesting, I threw a question out on Twitter the other day, and I said, "Who's your favorite fictional character?" And I think 90% of the people who wrote back said Sherlock Holmes. He must be one of the he still must be one of the all-time favorite characters in literature across the board.
People know him who don't even know him.
Yeah,
they see the silhouette, which has become his silhouette, even though it's nothing like what he's described in the book. But the deerstalker hat and the curved pipe, none of which are canonical, but it doesn't matter. You can show this in Africa, and people know that silhouette.
Yep, absolutely. What makes Sherlock Holmes so fun for you to write? Why is he fun to write?
He's fun to write, I think, for several reasons. And one of them is that the language is a lot of fun to write. This is from a world in which people still spoke English. And a lot of my favorite novels, whether we're starting with Dickens or Wilkie Collins or George Eliot or Anthony Hope, H. Rider Haggard, Robert Louis Stevenson, are part of that period where English prose, some people might argue, was at its height. I like that. I like also that Holmes seems to exist in two worlds, in either of which I think audiences can identify with. One is he exists long ago in a world that's sort of far enough away that it has a certain sort of fairy tale quality to it.
Yes.
Where some form of knight errantry is possible. I think what could definitely lump Holmes together with Don Quixote and other people tilting at windmills. And, Don Quixote is also a deducer. He tells Sancho, who's a very good Watson, that windmills are really giants. And, I'll translate it for you. The other world that Holmes occupies is our own. He's not so far away in the past that we don't know from a telephone or an automobile or a policeman and stuff. So he seems to straddle these worlds. I might also add, while I'm pontificating, that detective stories, I think, are popular because they deliver the exact opposite of what they promise. They promise thrills and chills and bloody bodies bent at unnatural instincts and the head bashed in by a person or persons but why is it then that people like to curl up with a good mystery? Why do they take this stuff to bed with them and read about all this mayhem? Well, they read about it because it's comforting. And why is it comforting? It's comforting because, unlike real life, which is anarchy, chaos, arbitrary, random. Things happen for no reason. You get pancreatic cancer. You have a skiing accident. You struck by lightning. Things that make no sense. But in detective literature, as somebody says sooner or later, it all adds up. And we like things that add up because we can't make sense of life, but detective stories make sense of life. And that's that's comforting.
Yes. I totally agree with that. For a minute, I was wondering if you were going to go along the track of that, with the golden age stuff of Doyle and those. It's all about sort of society being chaos and there being some sort of taming of chaos by the end. But I like your conclusion there a little bit more than that one, because it's the idea of things add up. Because I think that works across other genres. For example, I'm a big fan of the tough guy genre, the Philip Marlowe stuff, where chaos isn't tamed, but it does all add up. Mostly.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, taming it is naive at best. Even adding up is optimistic.
Definitely.
Things don't add up.
So you wrote the 7% Solution, followed by the Weston Horror, and then the Canary Trainer, which came out the last one came out in 1993. You then took a bit of a break in writing Sherlock Holmes, at least publishing Sherlock Holmes. And then you came out with a new book in 2019, the Peculiar Protocols. Why the hiatus, and why the desire to return to the character?
Well, it's a big question. I should note that between the West End Horror and the Canary Trainer was also quite a spread. It was from 76 to 92 when I wrote it.
Stuff going on.
I think one reason is that I write Sherlock Holmes novels when I get an idea that seems worthy of him, an idea that won't let go. This is a hobby for me. It's a recreation. I'm basically in the movie business, but it is fun. It is escapism for me, as it is for readers, to wander. But it has to be an idea that for some reason won't let go. When I wrote The Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols, that book had been cooking for 10 years. Once I got the idea of putting Sherlock Holmes together with the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And for your listeners who may be unfamiliar, the protocols of the learned elders of Zion is the most successful and vicious hoax of all time. And if you don't believe me, just Google it, and then we'll save ourselves a lot of time. Anyway, I thought, I knew it would be a very strange juxtaposition, but in terms of history and chronology, I knew it worked. And so I would have written it earlier if it hadn't taken me sort of 10 years to figure out how to do it. As it was, it's like 20 years between books or something. Then right away came The Return of the Pharaoh, which was based on a suggestion by my agent. What about Holmes in Egypt? With the exception of the West End Horror, my second Holmes book, they all get Holmes out of town. The West End Horror is a complete. It's the most sort of no frills, no bells and whistles Holmes adventure. It's set in his milieu, and but what's happened over the years is I find that my creative juices get going a little bit when I take him out of his comfort zone
Mm.
and put him in other places. This, quite by accident, was what happened when I put him together with Freud,
Mhm.
um, which took him to Vienna,
Yeah.
and then the Canary Trainer, which is in a way a sequel to the 7% Solution. What happened afterwards? Well, he didn't go back to London. He went to Paris and started giving violin lessons, and ultimately becomes involved with the Phantom of the Opera. So that kept him on the road.
Mm.
The Peculiar Protocols takes him as far away as Russia, and The Return of the Pharaoh finds him in Egypt.
Yes.
So yes, putting him on the road does something for me. There are other people, some of whom are listening, Bonnie, who managed to do this without taking him as far afield. But anyway, this is sort of my MO, or
Yeah.
it's become my MO.
I think that's a lot of fun. I always I like this. I like the idea of taking the established character, and cleverly putting them in different places and scenarios. I think that's one of the things that's quite fun with Holmes is he knows London. He knows. I feel like he just knows England so well that it's so easy for him to maneuver. But it's
Well,
there.
he can recognize the mud
Yes.
from somebody and said this is the Wigmore Street post office.
Right.
Uh, it, I read a whole paper about how the world of Holmes is very much London, unless they go to Boscombe Valley or Dartmoor or stuff. But even then, he's basically on his home turf.
Yes, yes. We have a couple of questions in the chat, Holmes related. Bonnie asks, "What does Sherlock Holmes look like in your imagination?"
Well, it's interesting because he he looks sort of the way Doyle described him, as opposed to the way most of the illustrators have drawn him. For one thing, he has apparently a very beaky nose.
Mm.
And Peter O'Toole had his nose fixed, and it's a shame that O'Toole never got to play Holmes. I think he might have been a very good one. But I always imagine that hawk-like visage
Mm-hmm.
and these very bright eyes. If your question, or if Bonnie's question is like, who are the actors? It's something that I sort of shy away from, because there's a Holmes in my imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and there are bits and pieces of other actors who may or may not, you know, if Peter Cushing were taller and so forth. There was an actor in the 50s on British television named Ronald Howard,
Yeah.
and H. Marion Crawford, who played Watson.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure this series was made for pennies. And again, I watched it at an impressionable age, but there was something about those two.
Mm-hmm.
And I confess I have a great weakness for that Watson, H. Marion Crawford. He's also in Lawrence of Arabia in a memorable couple of scenes. Um, and when I know everybody loves Jeremy Brett, now we're talking about performance, not physicality, but Jeremy Brett was always a trifle twitchy for
Yeah.
my taste. It was, I didn't quite understand that. But mainly he exists in my imagination, and he exists with that prominent nose,
Mm.
very slender, tall, the bright eyes,
Yeah.
uh, and maybe I haven't visualized him too much past that. But in my own descriptions of him, those are things that I find I tend to emphasize.
Yeah.
Maybe this is not very helpful.
I know. I think that is quite helpful. I mean, we all envision him a certain way. Some people, as you say, they envision a certain actor or something like that. But yeah, that's no.
Well, look at it this way: everybody also has their own image of Hamlet, you know. And who is Hamlet? I got news for you. We are Hamlet. Every one of us is Hamlet. There was years ago, the Lone Ranger. Everybody's the masked cowboy hero. The Lone Ranger went on a tour, a roadshow tour at theaters in the United States. And there, rope tricks and horses and whatever. And at the end of the show, or at some point during the show, he unmasked. And it was a disaster. Kids yelling down from the balcony, "That ain't him!" Why? Because we all know who the Lone Ranger really is. We all know who Hamlet really is. And we all know who Sherlock really is.
Exactly. Let's chat a little bit more about the return of the Pharaoh. This was a really fun book. I thought the story is very engaging, and it moves at a really good pace. I loved the setting that you put Holmes in. 1911 Egypt, 10 years before Tutankhamun is found, and there's Tutmany and all that kind of stuff is about to happen. You mentioned that it was your agent who gave you the idea, that sparked the idea of putting him in Egypt, right? So you got that idea, and then what was it that said, okay, here we go. I'm going to tie this in with Howard Carter, who is the guy who found Tutankhamun. I'm going to link Sherlock Holmes with these figures, not too long before this big discovery, and really kind of throw him into tombs and the mythology and the religion of it all. And what?
Well, I had been to Egypt in 1979. I had been inside the Great Pyramid. You crawl in through the robber's entrance. And like I think a lot of people, I have been doing a lot of reading about the looting of antiquities, not only from Egypt, but from Rome, from Greece. We all know about the Elgin marbles that are probably around the corner from where you live, in the British Museum. And this, the words which I think I approve of, but, sort of cultural appropriation, but in some cases, simply theft. And the argument on the part of, the Elginites is that this stuff was lying around on the ground. If we hadn't taken it, it would not be preserved. And there's probably an element of truth in that as well. But it's also true that a lot of antiquities, a lot of artwork, and particularly from Egypt, and there are loads of books about this. Sharon Waxman's book, Loot, and a more recent one, which I think is called just Under the Sand, has to do with all this treasure that rich people came to Egypt or came to Greece or came to Italy, gunning for this stuff and stuffing it into museums all around the world. And I never know how the plots of these things come to me, but it wound up being something about a missing nobleman, somebody who had succumbed to Egyptomania and had come to Egypt looking to make his fame and fortune by finding something buried of value, and then suddenly went AWOL himself. And that was sort of the genesis of it.
I like that. What it was also interesting to me is, as you mentioned earlier, about how you were talking to your dad and how his work reminded you of detective work. Um, I think there's also an element of the kind of the writer or the historian as detective, and obviously, these books are historical fiction, and you're using these novels to sort of in some way, dissect and explore and detect the past. Do
Which
you
is
is
what
that
archaeologists do, by the way, as well, as they're trying to make the past come to life.
Yes, yes.
My first screenplay when I was about 18 years old was The Life of Heinrich Schliemann. This shows you what a total geek I is. For those of your listeners who are unfamiliar with Heinrich Schliemann, he's the guy who discovered Troy. He's
Mm.
the first archaeologist worthy of the name. He was also a thief and a liar and a lot of other things. But when he was a little boy, his father in whatever German province was before Germany used to read him bedtime stories of the Iliad. And he said to his dad, where is Troy? And his dad explained it was a made up place. And Schliemann made a lot of money. Everything
Mm.
he touched turned to gold. He even wound up in California in 1849 in the middle of the gold rush. He made money there. He made money. And then he decided that he was going to go find Troy. And his major contribution to archaeology, besides all the gold that he found, was that he was the first person to promulgate the thesis that legends have their origin in reality.
Mm.
That there is such a thing as. And so he went looking for Troy, and he found 10 cities piled on top of one another. And I thought that would make a good movie.
Yeah, I mean it would, because that's your that never came about. But why not dust that?
No,
Dust
none of
that
my best ones ever come about.
isn't that the way it goes? I love that. So, but when it comes to your historical research, um, or your research in general, for those who don't know what that process might be like for writing a book like this, maybe enlighten people what that process is like. What is the research process like going into this kind of story?
Well, researching a book in some ways is like location scouting a movie. Is you go looking around, and you start by sort of looking at everything, and you don't really know what's going to prove valuable or
Mm.
what's not. What piece of jello is going to stick to the wall of your consciousness? Getting a little messy. But you go around, you look at things, you read things. I start reading about ancient Egypt, and then there are things that have just stayed with you forever. For example, when I was a kid, I saw Land of the Pharaohs with, Howard Hawks's movie with Joan Collins being buried alive. And if that wasn't cool, I don't know what. I was very relieved, when Martin Scorsese was all on about preserving this movie,
Mm.
which the color had faded and everything, and because it was a guilty pleasure of his. And for those of you who have not seen The Land of the Pharaohs, maybe it's not all that great of a movie, but it sure is eye-popping. It has a great score by Dmitri Tiomkin, and it's just got wonderful scenes. So yeah, that went into the hopper as well. So did my reading of King Solomon's Mines,
Mm.
H. Rider Haggard. God, I love that book. And a lifetime of, reading about Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon and
Mm.
all these archaeologists, starting again with Schliemann, but also including Arthur Evans, and Flinders Petrie and all those guys. And you sort of, I can't actually explain the process
Mm-hmm.
too much. And again, a little bit of a long-winded explanation. The oracle at Delphi tells Socrates that he's the wisest man in Greece. And Socrates thinks that can't be right. So he thinks all I need to disprove this is to find people wiser than I am.
Mm.
So he goes talking to all levels of Greek society, and finally he gets around to the poets. And I think by poets he means artists in general. They're probably all guys, but it was like painters and sculptors and writers. He said, surely these people who write and paint and sculpt so insightfully about the human condition are going to prove to be wiser than I am. And he said, imagine my surprise when they were the stupidest people I spoke to. They were, he says, like children. They were infantile. They talked no sense until they did their art.
Mm.
And then they go into a kind of trance and take dictation from God. And this they call inspiration. And then when it's over, you come out of it, it's hours later, you don't know where the fuck you've been, and suddenly these ideas have been flowing. So the next step, of course, is people, you know, who are interviewing the artists, whether it's Socrates or you, and saying, how do you do this? And unable to supply you with the answer, we start making up anecdotes. We start talking about ancillary things. For example, W.S. Gilbert asked, you know, how did you write the Mikado, your masterpiece? And he said, well, it was a Japanese sword that was hanging over my desk. Yeah. And it fell down. The thing almost decapitated me. And I picked it up and, he says, and then I got the idea. Well, maybe that's a true story. Maybe it's totally true. It simply doesn't explain at all how he wrote the Mikado.
Yes.
So there may be people, and I've read essays quite recently, in fact, by Eric Larson, who is a wonderful historian, about how he writes history. And I read a lot of history, not just Eric Larson, but David McCulloch and Joseph Ellis, and a lot of historians. I read a lot of that stuff. And things stick to me. I have notebooks. I write down things, but it could be the Return of the Pharaoh. Definitely is the product of a lifetime of curiosity and reading about Howard Carter. I read a book by a woman who calls herself Elizabeth Carter. That was not her name. Her name is Cecilia Holland, and she wrote a novel called Valley of the Kings that totally blew my mind. This is like 40 years ago. It was New Year's Day night, and I curled up with this book, and I realized within 2 chapters, this is an all-nighter.
Right.
I ain't going to sleep. I started putting logs on the fire and thinking, okay, so what was this book? Chapters 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 is all about Howard Carter and how he finds King Tut's tomb.
Mm-hmm.
Chapters 2, 4, 6, 8 is all about King Tut and how he gets into the tomb. Oh. And I thought, wouldn't this be a mind-blowing movie? They're burying him in one cut and digging him up in the other cut, and the things are going closer and closer together. I just was so happy reading this thing, and I wondered, wait a minute. One of the cool things in the book was that Howard Carter makes deductions on the basis of things that he finds. And then you go to the other story and find out whether the deductions are right or not. So in one scene, he sees Tut being given a bath by his wife in one of these hieroglyphic, paintings. And she's smiling at him, and Carter, who's a bachelor, idly wonders or wishes that there'd be a woman who might one day look at him with an expression like that.
Mm.
In the other story, she's the one who kills him.
Oh wow, I love that. I
Good book.
I totally get that. I'm with you on that in terms of trying to say kind of explain how the process is done. Is it is that trance-like thing. I'm sure you've had the experience where you've finished writing a chapter or whatnot, and then you step away and you come back to it and you're like, I wrote that.
No, it's even worse than that. It's when you come back to it years later. When you come back to it years later, I'm not sure I've ever read one of my books cover to cover since then. I don't know why, but I read. I said, "Wow, this is not shabby," But do I have any memory of it? No,
Nope.
I do not. I don't know if Bonnie rereads her books or not. But I don't think I do. I'm not sure why. I've rewatched movies of mine for sure.
Yeah, yeah. That is interesting though. Why don't you read the books but you'll see the films? And I can kind of relate because I don't really like to go back and reread things that I've written, and I don't really know why.
I've well, I can tell you one, kind of nuts and bolts reason, and that is I'm a slow reader. A
Same.
movie lasts 2 hours, give or take. That's
Yeah.
it. But for me to sit down and reread the 7% Solution, I'm not sure I have the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I totally relate to that. Absolutely. A couple of questions in the chat, and then we'll pivot a little bit into some Star Trek stuff now because I'm just conscious of time. So Filter says, "Hello, Luke, and hello, Nicholas. My question is, what yields the most satisfaction or a sense of pride? Directing a film or writing, or directing what you wrote?"
Well, that's a very interesting question. The difference between writing a book and making a film, I would put like this. When you are writing a book, you are limited only by your own abilities, and you are answerable basically to no one but those abilities. You are in total control. You can fuck it up or hit a home run with it or whatever, but you are answerable to nobody except a possible deadline for when the thing is supposed to be delivered. But otherwise, it's all on you. It's also extremely lonely. Day after day, the world is going by, or as Stephen Sondheim says in Pacific Overtures, kings are burning somewhere, but not here, not in what Shakespeare's described as a little room confining mighty men. There you are all by yourself. When you're making a movie, it is a collegial, a familial operation. If you don't like people, you probably shouldn't be doing this. But it is very much collaborative. It's collaborative. And your abilities are supplemented by those of the people with whom you pick to work. And you are also at the mercy of those combinations, those choices, and a million other variables: the budget, the studio, the weather, the stars, the world events. When we did Star Trek 6, we basically filmed the coup that occurred in Soviet Russia, where Premier Gorbachev simply disappeared and nobody knew if he was alive or dead. And we'd already filmed his assassination. We called it Gorkon in the movie. And we're suddenly is this like good or bad for the movie that that we predicted, that we filmed the coup before it happened? And did we waste a lot of time worrying about poor Mr. Gorbachev? Was he alive or dead? I'm ashamed to say that I don't think we did. It was just, is this good or bad for the film? Does the star have a cold today? Has the money arrived to pay the people? Did you do a good job picking the angles for the camera? Did you say the right thing to the actor? And so on. A million variables. And by the time the movie is over, you're partied out. I'm ready to go back to my little one room with the mighty men in it and chill. But the other part of the question was directing my own stuff versus directing somebody else's stuff. And that's a tougher question. I think that I am a better director doing my own stuff than I necessarily am with other people's stuff. But it's also true that if you have a director who really understands what you've done, when Herb Ross directed the 7% Solution, I think by and large, I was very well served in that movie. Yeah. Whereas I've seen a lot of movies where I wanted to kill the director who was directing my stuff because he so missed how to do it and what it was about and what it was meant to be. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm the world's greatest director, but I tend to do well, I think, with my own stuff. But some stuff comes out, even if I didn't write the day after. I did not write the screenplay or the novel, for that matter, of The Deceivers, which maybe is my best directing work. I don't know. So it's a tough question to answer.
Yeah. I think kind of building off that, sort of, Scott R. McKinley asks, first he asked, did you have any input with the 7% Solution film?
I wrote the script.
Yep. So you had a little bit of input then.
And I helped cast it, and I was on the set the whole time.
Yeah. He also asks, what did you think of Nicole Williamson's portrayal of Holmes?
I really thought it was remarkable. It's funny that when people talk about Sherlock Holmes in the movies, they seldom mention Nicole. They'll talk about Jeremy Brett, they'll talk about Basil Rathbone, they'll talk about Christopher Plummer, but they don't mention Nicole. And I'm not sure why it is, except that the 7% Solution is not a Sherlock Holmes movie. It's a movie about Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. And I think for some reason, that almost takes it out of the running, out of the contemplation. But I think, and this is a movie that also depicts Holmes in a way that he is not typically depicted as, deep in the throes of a cocaine addiction from which he must be weaned. And that may be a difficult pill to swallow, but I think he is brilliant at convincing that, I wish, I suppose that maybe he should have had brown hair. Maybe his nose should have been bigger. But that's me anyway.
Yeah. I thought he was brilliant in the role. One other question from I Want My TV Now asks, has there been a project that fell through but you loved and wish it was made? If so, were you able to squeeze those ideas in another project if you were able to talk about it?
I said a minute ago that I think many of my best scripts have never been filmed. One advice I always give to writers is don't throw anything away because you may, need to resurrect it. This isn't an exact example, but there were scenes or moments that I cut out of Time After Time for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And I stuck them into Star Trek 4, which is the same movie where time travelers go to San Francisco, in one case from the future, in the other case from the past. But I found places to recycle material. That's why you don't throw things away.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In your memoir, View from the Bridge, there's a quote in it that I really liked, and you say, "Don't hold your breath, waiting for the right project just because you're not getting the films you want." I wonder, do you think that is possibly one of the biggest hurdles that creatives have? They're so hung up because they're not getting the thing that they want, that they sort of shoot themselves in the foot by not just taking something to sort of springboard them onto the next and get them closer to their dream project?
I think that, first of all, nobody can be that stupid as I was trying to, get the one movie I wanted. I wanted to make my movie of Robertson Davies' novel, Fifth Business, and I had written the screenplay, and it remains one of my best all these years later. And I was saying, if I can't do that, then I'm not doing anything. And, that was not doing me or anybody else any good. You have to start someplace, and you have to learn your craft. And you learn best by doing, not by sitting there holding your breath. Incidentally, the name of my memoir, just for the record, is not A View from the Bridge. That's a play by Arthur Miller. My memoir is called The View from the Bridge. And they shouldn't be confused, or you'll be reading the wrong thing.
Well, yeah, The View from the Bridge. There we go, guys. Okay, let's pivot a little bit into a little bit of Star Trek stuff. By the way, links to your books, the Return of the Pharaoh, are in the description on this video if you're watching on YouTube. So go purchase Return of the Pharaoh. Great book. And
thank you.
Anything else that's available, go purchase that as well. And we'll give it another plug at the end. So it what's interesting to me with Wrath of Khan, you came into Star Trek really not, you weren't a fan. You didn't know anything about it. Wasn't your cup of tea. Do you think coming in as not a fan, do you think that helped?
It may have helped. I should interject that I don't think artists are the best judges of their own work. In fact, sometimes they're the worst judges. Bizet wrote the Toreador song and said, "Oh, well, the public wants shit. There it is." So you could be wrong. I cannot fully account for or explain my relationship with Star Trek. I can recount facts as I remember them, although my memory, which is normally credited for being a very good one, but it's not a perfect one, and I've made mistakes. I've remembered things wrong. People said, did you know Gene Roddenberry? And I, for years, said, well, I met him before I did the movie, but he wasn't part of the movie. And then later, I was presented with a bunch of memoranda between me and Gene Roddenberry about the screenplay of The Wrath of Khan, which he hated. And I'd suppressed all memory of that.
Yeah.
So, whether it was a good thing or not that I came as an outsider, I think is a hard question to answer, and certainly a hard question for me to answer. The only answer I can give is it was the only way, because I simply had never really seen it when it was on TV.
Yeah.
And I was, a kid. I didn't get it. I think it's safe to say I missed everything that was important about it. I missed the international, interracial, intersexual cast. I missed the idea that people of goodwill could come together to solve problems. All I saw was the stupid sets, the stupid costumes, and the man with the pointy ears. And I just, I didn't stick around long enough to understand why it was worthwhile, why it was important, why it was valuable.
Yeah. That's what's interesting about that is you weren't immersed in it, growing up, but it seems it's quite clear that you learned and you began to understand what it is about, what its core essence, Trek essence really is.
Well, I figured it reminded me of something. It reminded me of something that I really loved.
Yes.
Which was another series of books that I read about the same time as I was reading Sherlock Holmes. And this was a series of novels by a guy who called himself C.S. Forrester. And these were novels about a captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, Captain Horatio Hornblower. He was clearly based on Nelson, or else why would you call him Horatio? I love these books. And he had all kind of adventures, and he had a girl in every port, and that seemed good to me, age 13. And I said, oh, this is Hornblower in outer space. Kirk is a version of Hornblower in outer space. And so that's how I wrote it.
Yeah. I think that was, it worked. Obviously it's a perfect kind of marriage because they really do. It really does play off that, I think. Bonnie mentions in the chat that there's a tremendous intersection between Sherlockians and Star Trek fans. I completely agree. Completely agree with that.
Well, I cemented it because in Star Trek 6, Spock sort of obliquely claims descent from Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
He says
go on.
He says in the movie, when they're trying to figure out something, he says, an ancestor of mine once maintained that when you eliminate the impossible, however improbable, whatever remains must be the truth.
Yes.
Well, this is basically Spock saying that his ancestor is Sherlock Holmes. I just threw that in.
I love that line. I actually have a question about that line. I'll ask you now. Growing up, I was like, oh yeah, he's related to Sherlock Holmes. But then there's a part of me that goes, well, is it Sherlock Holmes or is it Doyle? Who is Spock actually related to when he's quoting that, when he's saying an ancestor of mine? Because he could be read both ways.
Now you're entering the Hall of Mirrors here. Those are questions that I usually answer by saying, well, what do you think? Because I don't know.
The nerd in me would say that it's Doyle, because the nerd in me is thinking about all of those Next Generation episodes where Data's in the holodeck pretending to be Sherlock Holmes because he's a fictional character. So I'm like, well, this is the world of, but that's the super nerd in me.
Except that I've never seen those shows, so you have to leave me out of that part of the equation.
But it works. It works both ways. I think it could work both ways. But I've always loved that line. I like it either way, whether he's related to Doyle or related to Holmes himself. Either one is, I love that, because there's the Spock and Holmes. I mean, come on, they're basically the same. Well, they're not the same. But
they're very similar.
Yeah,
they're very similar enough to, sort of play with the idea.
Yes, yeah, and it's no coincidence that those two are some of my childhood heroes. Two of my favorite heroes is Spock and Sherlock Holmes. On Spock, what's the secret to writing? What's the secret to killing off a beloved character and doing
it well?
I mean, that's what
I'm not being facetious.
Yeah.
I think that when people were saying to me, you can't kill Spock, I said, first of all, fans don't know what they want until they get it. It is now very fashionable, and I've been in the business and I've seen this, for people to be always looking at what's that thing called not TikTok, Twitter, to see what the fans think, what they want. I don't give a fuck what they want.
Yes.
Robert Bresson, the filmmaker, said, "My job is not to find out what the public want and give it to them. My job is to make the public want what I want." And that's my job. And if I had left it up to the fans, Spock would not have died. But if he hadn't died, maybe there wouldn't be a million Star Treks. I don't know. So I think that it's very stupid is the word I'm groping for, to sort of wait for the fans to dictate what the art is. Not made by committee. Art is a dictatorship. It's this is my book, this is my movie. If you don't want to read it, don't read it. If you don't want to watch it, don't buy the ticket. If you don't want to sit there, turn it off, switch to another channel. But this is me wanting what I want. I write the books that I would like to read. I write the movies or direct the movies that I would like to watch. And I make an assumption. I can't second guess 60 million people that I never met. I would never tell you a joke that I didn't think was funny. In the hope that you might think it funny. I won't get a laugh that way. I just know it. I think that the assumption I make is, if I like it, other people will like it too. And sometimes I'm right and sometimes I'm wrong. But that's the only way I know to create something, to be creative. It has to be the vision of somebody who's steering the boat, for lack of a better analogy. And as I say, sometimes you wind up on the rocks. The name of the game of being an artist is showing up. You come up to the plate and you swing for the fences. And sometimes you're going to strike out. And sometimes you'll get on base. And once in a blue moon, if you're lucky, you hit a grand slam, and you never know how that actually happened, but you did, if you're lucky.
I totally agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. And I sort of kind of echo. I totally get that lamenting over the fact that so many people look to Twitter for their answers to what the fans want, and that is such a strong influence on what is being done and created. I think that's actually quite.
I could care less.
So okay, so when you were doing Wrath of Khan, there's interesting things that are sort of added, I think, to Star Trek in that movie, and that is you were interested in what the hell were they reading on these ships and all that kind of stuff,
or were they reading at all?
So how important, I guess, how important was it for you to add that texture to the Star Trek universe, and are you aware of its domino effect throughout further films and series?
Well, I think I was always trying to make Star Trek clear to myself and clear to my dad, because I knew he'd see the movie and he'd never seen Star Trek. So I thought, well, I better put a title on that says in the 23rd century, because otherwise he won't know. So I stuck that in. And then I was, I think a lot of science fiction has a great deal of trouble predicting the future accurately. Sometimes very accurately. I think Jules Verne was really astonishing, but a lot of prognostications and even nonfiction prognostications about what's going to happen in the next 10 years, it was always wildly off. It was interesting to me that Star Trek managed to get cell phones right. That was like a big deal.
Yeah.
But so I was trying to make the Star Trek world comprehensible to me.
Mm.
And the only way I could do it was the Navy, was submarines. I originally wanted them to be smoking cigarettes, but I got overruled with that. I tried to make all the sets really small, because when you're on those ships, and I've been on some of those ships, whether it's submarines or destroyers, they ain't built for comfort.
No.
They are really small, and somebody said some of the best acting takes place in very small places. Forget about Lawrence, but yeah, for the rest of it, people in a coal mine, people in a submarine, it's intense when you.
Yeah.
So I was mushing the walls together and making everything as much like submarines in the Navy as I could. That was sort of how I went about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think adding that, I think the way you did that was such a, it really made sense, I think. Because I remember like when I would watch Wrath of Khan and the subsequent sequels, that you do get that claustrophobic sense of this is a tight space. There's the way the lighting was, you really get that sense of submarine sort of action there.
I was crazy about I think the best movie Walt Disney ever made was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I also loved the movie. I didn't even realize the influence this had, because sometimes you're influenced by things without being aware of it.
Yes.
But I was influenced, I realized 30 some odd years later, by a movie that I think I'd forgotten I'd seen, called The Enemy Below. And The Enemy Below stars Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jurgens as a destroyer captain and a U-boat captain. It was directed by somebody that nobody will ever guess in a million years. The greatest trivia question in movies, who directed The Enemy Below, was Dick Powell.
Oh, Dick Powell. Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's a great movie. It's a great movie.
Yeah.
And the whole Mutara Nebula thing, I think, came from that movie.
Yes. No, I love that. Dick Powell's great. He's one of my favorite Marlowes. I love his Marlowe.
He was a good Marlowe, and before that, he was great in Busby Berkeley movies.
Yeah.
And then he was good in the, as I don't know how old he was when he was in A Midsummer Night's Dream at Warner Brothers with Olivia de Havilland and Vera Teasdale and Mickey Rooney and Joey Brown and James Cagney. You should see that Midsummer Night's Dream is a hoot.
Yeah. Cool. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll wrap up with a few more quick questions then.
Okay.
I have a question about Star Trek 6, and it's kind of a two-part question. And Saavik was meant to come back in that, and she didn't. So first, my question is why didn't she?
As far as I know, the reason she didn't come back was that Kirstie Alley, for one reason or another, and I don't know the reason, declined to play her, declined to reprise the role.
And it did. Was it that was you wanted Kirstie Alley back and not Robin Curtis?
Yes,
she played. Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, to me, having written and cast Saavik, that was.
Yeah,
it was that. It was nothing against Robin Curtis, who's a very good actress.
Yes, yeah. I was always, it was interesting because I never really, I guess I never really knew what that dynamic was, or why they, because you could have just recast Saavik, but I get that now. Your mind was like, she is my Saavik, and if I can't have that Saavik, I'd rather not. That totally makes sense to me. You answered the question about the Holmes reference. I'm trying to skim through what I have here. Um, actually, have you seen? I'm curious if you've seen any of the current season of Star Trek Picard.
I have not.
Um, it's really quite amazing. It's very very good. But there's a lot of wonderful touches, homages to Wrath of Khan.
I've
In
heard.
the
I've
first
heard.
4 episodes. It's excellent. They're nicely done. Um, on homage, what's your take on Into Darkness? If you're happy to say, if you don't want to, that's also fine.
Which one is that one?
That's the second of the J.J. Abrams movies with Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan.
Well, I guess I didn't understand it.
In what way? Just generally, I think we're all in that same boat. To be fair.
Well, I remembered somebody saying to me, what did you think about the fact that they changed the whole timeline?
Mm-hmm.
And my comment was, they did? I guess I was confused, but you see, I'm not great at following some really advanced stuff. The other night I watched and had a great time, actually, Everything Everywhere All at Once,
Yeah.
which I thought was a really terrific piece of cinema.
Yeah.
But I could never have dreamt up anything like that, and I barely understood what was going on. And I suspect that the JJ was simply so clever that I wasn't clever enough to keep up with it. So I couldn't really understand who the Khan person was and why he wasn't Khan.
Yeah. It was interesting. There's obviously a lot of references to Wrath of Khan, kind of redone and repurposed and homaged or whatnot in that. But no, I found that quite interesting. In terms of future Star Trek projects, are you happy to tell people about the Khan miniseries?
There is a Khan podcast coming. Called Star Trek Khan CD Alpha 5. And for those of you who are fans, you'll probably know what that's about.
Yes. If this is more of a hypothetical, if you could, and not to do with the podcast, but if you could, because this originally was going to be a 3-part TV event, right?
Right.
Who would you cast as Khan now? If you were doing this for the screen, do you have someone in mind?
I can honestly say that I don't. It's a very interesting question because in the original film, Khan Noonien Singh is clearly an Asiatic name. He's Indian, or he's from the Far East, as we used to call it. Yes. But he was played by Ricardo Montalban, a Mexican.
Yes.
So the question is, do you get somebody who is Hispanic to be like the Khan of the movie and the TV show?
Yeah.
Or do you find someone who is appropriate to that name?
Yes.
And be sort of politically correct? It's a good question. And I think you can argue it a lot of different ways. I should say, while I'm mouthing off, that I am deeply suspicious of what I'll call woke fanaticism.
Okay.
Which, if you carry it to its logical extreme, is really stupid. If you're doing a movie in which there's a murderer, why don't you cast a murderer in the movie? That kind of reductio ad absurdum is not, actors you're supposed to pretend to be somebody else.
Yes.
In fact, I think a better name for actors would be pretenders.
Yeah.
Are you good at pretending? Can you make me believe in what you're pretending? If you do, I'll give you an Oscar. If you can make me believe what you're pretending to be, or the
Yes.
jeopardy in which you are pretending to reside. But once you say, oh, yes, only a one-armed man could play a one-armed man,
Yeah.
then we're no longer doing the pretending.
Yes. Yeah. I am in full agreement with that. There's a funny sketch. If you know the comedian Bill Burr by any chance,
Sure.
there's a funny sketch in one of his Netflix specials that also touches upon that. And yeah, I agree. You sort of lose sight of the point of acting if it's so focused on the individual has to be the individual that is on the paper, and it's like, well, that's not entirely true. That's not entirely true. um all right, last question I'll ask you is, I do want to for you to kind of talk a little bit about the day after, the TV movie that you made, because I think I read where I know that is something that you've done that's you have a lot of you're quite proud about because of its what happened as a result of that. So I would love to hear a
You
little
mean
bit about
saving the world?
saving the world. You saved the world, man. Tell
I
everyone how
saved
you
it
saved the world.
until Donald Trump, the pussy grabber in chief, walked out of the treaty that he signed with Gorbachev. But yes, Ronald Reagan saw my nuclear war TV movie,
Mm,
which I did not write. Ed Hume was the writer.
mhm.
Um, but it went on the air in 1983, and it has the distinction of being the most watched movie ever made for television.
Yeah.
And it's a record that will never be broken because there's too many channels. So I win. But it was 100 million. It was 100 million people
100 million. Yeah.
watched it in one night. It freaked out Ronald Reagan, who had come to power believing in such a thing as a winnable nuclear war.
Mm,
He saw the movie and eventually went off to Reykjavik and signed the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty with Gorbachev,
mhm.
whom he decided was not the evil empire after all. Now they are. Anyway, well, times change. Anyway, so I counted that as, so far the most valuable thing I've gotten to do with my life.
Yeah.
And people keep asking me, well, can you remake the movie? Would Donald Trump ever watch the movie? And I said, he won't watch it because it's not about him. And so far, I haven't found any network that was any more willing to make The Day After now than they were originally. Because
Yeah.
at ABC, nobody wanted to make the movie except Brandon Stoddard, who ran ABC Circle Films. And he did it in the teeth of
Mm.
universal opposition.
What was the reason, for those who might not know? Like, why was there so much resistance to make it?
Everybody dies. The function of network TV, whether
Yeah.
it's ABC, NBC, or the other one, CBS, is to sell advertising.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to make a movie about nuclear war in which everybody dies. If you have a nuclear war, it's not going to be good. And so all the advertisers, General Motors and General Foods and General Mills and all the generals, they ran away. And so when they put it on the air, there was no sponsors. I think in the beginning, we had one sponsor or two. We had Orville Redenbacher Popcorn sponsored it, but otherwise, no.
Wow.
So yeah, that's why they all hated the movie at ABC.
Yeah. But it's funny though, because obviously it's like you're saying earlier. The people don't know what they want until they get it, and then, I mean, that those numbers gotta tell them something. Gotta tell them something.
We were all
Um,
in shock,
yeah.
including me. I was just like, really?
Would you want to see it remade today?
Yes, I would like to see movies that help people think. I don't want to tell them what to think.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to tell them what to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
I
think that's
think
the role of it.
we're all hanging right now by a very slender thread. We're in much deeper shit now than we were in 1983.
Yes, yes. It's very true, and it's as you kind of bring it back to what you were saying earlier about the the role of the artist. You know that they're dumb people until they're doing their art, and then they're really very very insightful, and that's I think that really is the role of artists, and that is not to tell people what to think, as you're saying, but to present
Things you might
ideas.
want to think about.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and maybe that's why I think that's probably why one of the many reasons why you kind of smashed it with Star Trek, because that is the essence. That is one of the main key things of it is Star Trek never really told you what to think, but it gave you things to think about. And that's something that I've always loved about that show. All right, we'll wrap up now. I've kept you a bit longer than I initially planned, so thanks for thanks for being for doing that.
That's okay.
Do you what are you reading or watching for those at home wondering, looking for a recommendation maybe?
Oh gosh. I'm reading so many things. I think I'm rereading The Path Between the Seas by David McCullough, which is
Mhm.
about the building of the Panama Canal.
Mhm.
I've watched a lot of I watch a lot of sort of off the wall stuff. A television series, a French television series called Nicolas Le Floch, about a cop during the reign of Louis XV.
Oh,
So it's right before the French Revolution,
yeah.
and so it's rich in period detail while they're figuring out who murdered whom and stuff like that. But
Yes.
it's fun to look at all the stuff like where do people go to the bathroom and during the French Revolution and
Yes.
stuff like that. I saw that Everywhere, Everything at Once, which I loved. I loved the movie White Noise. I thought that was terrific. I
Mm.
loved the movie Tar. I thought that was terrific. The other day I crossed town on a Sunday to see Billy Wilder, 5 Graves in Cairo, which, oh my God, that you may say that's lesser Billy Wilder, but lesser Billy Wilder is still better than anything else. It
Yep.
was really great. So like that, very eclectic,
Yeah.
very
I love that.
eclectic stuff. I've been reading novels by an Irish author named Kevin Power. He wrote a novel called Bad Day in Black Rock, and he wrote another novel called White City, and
Mm.
I really loved both of those.
Yeah.
Um, like that.
There you go. That's a lot of references for people to go look up. And then the very last thing is what are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm working on Holmes #6, which is called Sherlock Holmes and the Telegram from Hell. It's the first time I've used Holmes in a title, but
Mm.
when you hear the title, you have to have it. And I'm working on the podcast
Yeah.
of Star Trek Con CD Alpha 5. Those are the things that sort of keep me awake at night and in the day.
Yes, wonderful. Well, I look forward to reading both the Sherlock Holmes and the Telegraph from Hell, and listening to Con City Alpha 5 when that comes out. So yeah, again, thanks Nicholas for hanging out with me tonight and chatting Star Trek and Sherlock Holmes. And there's many other things I could talk your ear off about, but we'll save that for another time if I can have you on at some point in the future.
Sure.
Cool. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't, like I said, you can go to the description and you can pick up Nicholas's books that way. But do go check them out. And if you can't find something like, say, The Day After, I'm sure there are outlets where you can watch that even today. Anyway, thanks, guys. I'm gonna play a little outro. So if you just hang on a second, Nicholas, and then we'll close out. But everyone else, have a good evening.